Good morning and most welcome to 1270. Yes, it's a merely 30 left to 1300. Thank you all for listening and watching, for your incredible patience. It's just beyond belief, and your responses and comments, of course. We have about 5-6 degrees. It's definitely clement, unusual for the season. We are approaching December next week already, and this Sunday will be the first of Advent. And look, it's still green. How on earth that is possible? I will continue today with Roberto Unger's A Singular Universe. It is becoming more and more lucid as it progresses, and we are approaching the end of Unger section. I think I'll put in a pause after Unger and have a sort of a sabbatical until we press on to Smolin. We already have done a fantastic job. I think patience is possibly the most important, because in the closing of the Western mind of modern academia, all realizations are instant. Students are encouraged not to wait, ask questions directly, get answers directly. They are embodying the unreality of time and of the world. It is Newtonian in itself. Those quick questions defy the idea that there should be something beyond this. Direct answer, ADHD, OCD, lack of focus. Those are all expressions of Newtonian paradigm. How can you wait if time doesn't exist? And how can knowledge be? Because knowledge is the passing of time. Modern knowledge is the instantaneous structure. I often mention this, that what Unger and Smolin is revealing is the combat between structure and reality / time, I would say. Very important. And most definitely not the same. Should not confuse structure with model. Also incredibly important, has nothing to do with model. You get a feeling for it after a while. Reality, time, reality gives odd associations. Time, when we learn in this by putting into contradistinction that Unger helps us with, we slowly learn what time must be. So it's a training. I would say, I think this is against the habit of a lifetime. I was also thinking about, since yesterday when we had a lecture event in quantum mechanics, I was also thinking about models, how then they've been eroded and non-functional. I think this is a return of models, model thinking, thinking in an abstract way. Unreality of time make abstract thinking impossible, I'd say. So, page 253. In the Earth and life sciences, the principle of natural history undermine the requirements for the enactment of the philosophy of being. The mutability of types, seen against the background of the path dependence and of the co-evolution of laws and states of affairs. Neither a permanent structure nor permanent laws obtain. Everything is historical in the subject matter of the naturalist. The kinds of the things that there are and the ways in which they change Darwinian evolution is not the sole basis of this predominance of process over structure. And of becoming over being. Otherwise, these facts would be confined to the realm of life, whereas they extend to lifeless nature as well, to the historical typology of rocks, for example, viewed in the light of the evolution of the earth. When we turn to the institutional and ideological structures of society, the failure of the approach recommended by the philosophy of being is even harder to deny. The formative, institutional, and ideological regimes of a society amount to a frozen politics. They represent the outcome of a temporary interruption and a relative containment of conflict over the terms of social life. They change in character as well as in content. That is to say, in the extent to which they either insulate themselves against challenge or lay themselves open to revision. Either disguising or exhibiting their nature as frozen politics. Although they change under constraint and rise or fall according to the advantages and attractions that they offer. No historical laws govern their succession. In society, even more than in the manifest nature studied by the naturalist, there's no permanent set of indivisible types of organization and no unchanging system of forms of change on which a social theory faithful to the spirit of a philosophy of being can fix. The deep structure social theories of the 19th and early 20th centuries, with their characteristic belief in a law-like succession of indivisible institutional systems, have been discredited. The hopes of the philosophy of being dashed in the domains of natural history and social life, then pass to the study of the fundamental and hidden constituents and laws of nature. The subject matter of physics and of its allied sciences. Before recalling why those hopes must there too be disappointed, consider one more instance, the second in this list, of the philosophy of being in the history of thought. This second instance is speculative monism. The idea that there is only one being, all the distinct beings that appear to exist in the world, including our own selves, are on this view illusory, derivative, or superficial. If they are not unreal, they are at least less real than the one hidden being that underlies appearances. The most determined expressions of this point of view in the history of Western philosophy are Parmenides, Spinoza, and Schopenhauer. In many other thinkers, speculative monism appears in more or less qualified form. For the most radical versions of speculative monism, the plurality of beings is an illusion. For the qualified versions, it is a shallow and ephemeral reality. the relation of speculative monism to the philosophy of becoming is ambiguous and paradoxical. In one sense, it is the opposite of this philosophy. In another sense, it can be just another version of it. They can share in common the idea that everything changes or turns, as Anaximander wrote, into everything else under the dominion of time. Two factors determine whether a particular speculative monism represents the antithesis of the philosophy of becoming, or an expression of it. The first factor is whether and how the doctrine acknowledges the reality of the kinds of things that exist at any given time, and the distinctive way in which these natural kinds change. The reverse side of a view of the distinctions among phenomena must be an account of how they change and of how change changes. This last one is extremely important. Very few people today think that change changes. But I would say any philosophy that doesn't take that in acknowledgement is a defunct philosophy. The second, yet more basic factor is whether the doctrine affirms the inclusive reality of time as speculative monism that denies or discounts the reality of time, as most versions of speculative monism in Western and non-Western philosophy have, stands in stark contradiction to the tenets of a philosophy of becoming. a speculative monism that affirms the inclusive reality of time, moves in the direction of such a philosophy. Even, however, when monism moves in that direction, it suffers from a defect that ought to be judged fatal. The lack of any account of how the one becomes the many, or comes to appear under the illusion of the many, and how the different forms of the many, or of the one, change into one another. It lacks purchase on the manifest world and engagement with the methods of inquiry and the organized disciplines by which we seek to grasp the workings of nature and of society. It too floats, hence the reason to designate it as speculative. There is a family of views closely related to speculative monism that may at first seem to offer a solution to this problem. It goes under the label panentheism. It sees God or being, mind, the one, as constitutive of a world that the one being nevertheless exceeds. It struggles to form a loose view of how this one becomes expressed or embodied in the distinct types of being that we encounter in nature. It sees the many as emanations of the One. The theory of emanation, however, has never been formulated in a way that would draw it close to the practices and sciences by which we can prove the world around us and discover something of how it works. Under the panentheist dispensation, monism has thus invariably continued to be speculative, whether in the hands of Plotinus and Nicholas of Unger or a Heidegger. For all these reasons, speculative monism represents a dead end in the history of thought. A dead end to which the philosophy of being may find itself confined if its two other main instances fail. Earlier in this chapter, I presented a proto-ontology, a series of postulates of reality, plurality, and connection, listing the minimal assumptions about the real that a science faithful to the thesis of the singular existence of the universe. Of the inclusive reality of time and of the selective realism of mathematics must take. This proto-ontology could be better labeled an anti-ontology. It eschews the project of classical ontology with its commitment to describe a permanent typology of being. an additional function of the proto-ontology or anti-ontology outlined earlier now becomes clear. It is to exclude the option presented by speculative monism, at least in the radical variant of the monist conception, the variant denying the reality of the many. The proto-ontology excludes this variant by virtue of its postulate of plurality, that there are many things rather than one. The postulate of plurality denies the defining thesis of a radical speculative monism. The significance of the postulate of plurality for science is made clear by the postulate of connection. The many connect. These connections are causal, presupposing time, and they may or may not take recurrent and law-like form. Thus, they are antecedent to any laws of nature rather than derivative from them. The study of causal connections in nature is the fundamental subject matter of science. The study of laws of nature is its occasional subject matter. The third instance of the philosophy of being, alongside classical ontology with its typology of natural kinds and speculative monism with its insistence on the oneness of being, is the one established in the dominant tradition of modern physics. the failure of the philosophy of being in this domain would leave this philosophy with no refuge other than speculative monism, given that it has already failed in its other domain. The effort to make sense of the manifest world, of natural history and social life as we encounter it on the scale of human action and perception. The twin mainstays of this third instance of the philosophy of being are the ideas of a permanent structure of ultimate constituents of the world and of an immutable framework of laws of nature governing the interactions among these constituents. There is one fundamental set of beings the building blocks of all the others, and one unchanging system of change. To reveal this set and this system is the task of science. Nature, according to this view, is a differentiated structure, subject to change on the basis of a fixed stock of elements. This stock is described at two complementary or superimposed levels by particle physics and by chemistry. The workings of this differentiated structure conform to recurrent and changeless regularities. The laws, symmetries, and constants of nature. These regularities underlie all causal connections and justify all causal explanations. In such a view of nature, time cannot be fully real. If it is real, it is not inclusive. The basic elements and fundamental laws are changeless. They have no history other than the inscrutable jumping off point of an infinite initial singularity at the origins of the universe. Where there is no change, there cannot be variation of change. Hence, time cannot be inclusively real. Part of reality, if not all of it, lies beyond the reach of time. If nature at its most fundamental level has such a character, mathematics is its privileged expression. The differentiated structure is a differentiable manifold. The existence of changeless forms of changing, connecting the phenomena, can be registered by laws of nature, stated as mathematical equations, that the relations among mathematical propositions are timeless, whereas the phenomena that they represent are time-bound, ceases to be perplexing if the timelessness of mathematics is at least partly second by limits on the timeliness of nature. In this view of what nature is ultimately like, once we see beyond the middle range at which natural history works, that the argument of this book seeks to challenge. In this contest, the issue of the reality of time plays a major part. Prompted by its own most important discovery, the discovery that the universe has a history, cosmology must become a historical science. It cannot do justice to its own findings within the boundaries of the approach to nature that I have just summarized. Through the reorientation of its agenda and its assumptions, it must cast its lot with a philosophy of becoming, at least in the same relatively inexplicit sense in which the physics of Newton and of his successors tied itself to the philosophy of being. It must do so out of explanatory convenience and constraint, not out of philosophical prejudice. The argument must take place at many levels, all the way from the internal disputes of physics and of the other specialized sciences to the large and loose contrast between these clashing metaphysical programs. In between the scientific and the metaphysical stands natural philosophy. It enjoys no prerogative to obtain for its arguments and proposes an exemption from the empirical discipline to which science is subject. It must sometimes do its work by seeking to dissolve the marriage of factual findings and ontological pre-commitments that marks any established system of scientific ideas. It seeks to renew the dialectic between empirical discovery and theoretical imagination by enlarging the range of available conceptions and by allowing us to see with new eyes what we mistakenly think that we have already understood. And now to chapter 5 on page 259. The mutability of the laws of nature. Changing laws. Do the laws of nature change? Many philosophers and scientists have claimed that the immutability of the laws of nature is a premise of the work of science. In pressing this claim, they reify a particular idea of science, an idea that takes the central tradition of physics from Newton to Einstein as the model of science. For it is only in this tradition that the notion of changeless laws of nature has had a secure place. Nevertheless, only very few physicists, Dirac and Feynman first among them, have explicitly questioned the immutability of the laws of nature and suggested that they must have been different in the early universe. There are other branches of science in which the notion of unchanging laws does not immediately occur to a practicing scientist unless he is anxious to show how his scientific practice can be made to conform or to appear to conform to the supposed master science, modern physics. We commonly think of the explanatory force of the regularities of natural evolution that are enshrined in the contemporary Darwinian synthesis as having developed together with life. This joint transformation of the phenomena and of the regularities that they exhibit is not a one-time phenomenon. It keeps happening. For example, our account of the workings of the Mendelian mechanisms in the course of evolution is modified by the arrival of sexual reproduction. A weak reductionism may assert that these effective laws can all be reduced to the supposedly fundamental and immutable laws of physics. However, such a claim amounts to little more than an empty genuflection to the model of explanation established in the dominant tradition of physics. It has no consequence for explanation in the earth and life sciences. The idea of the unchanging character of the laws of nature has an especially close connection to the Newtonian paradigm. Changeless laws are invoked to explain within a configuration space the contours of which are defined by the unexplained initial conditions. A working assumption of this explanatory practice is that the laws applicable to the phenomena within the configuration space are held constant. The theoretician observer remains in a timeless and godlike position outside the configuration space, wielding as his instrument the immutable laws of nature. It is precisely the universe as a whole, however, rather than any particular part of it, that is in question when we assert or assume the laws of nature to be unchanging. this style of explanation, we argue, cannot be legitimately applied to the whole of the universe. Its province is the explanation of local realities, bounded by stipulated initial conditions. The enthronement of physics as the exemplary science is followed by the extrapolation to cosmology of an explanatory strategy that has no legitimate cosmological use. Those who claim that immutability of the laws of nature is a requirement of any science also make another mistake. Alongside their baseless entrenchment of a particular way of doing science, they treat a question of natural fact as if it were an indispensable presupposition of thought, or at least of science. I would say in all areas, but that is my remark. To succumb to this temptation is unjustifiably to circumscribe the self-subversive and revolutionary potential of science. Our interest is exactly the opposite. To reformulate assumptions that we are accustomed to treat as unavoidable requirements of empirical thinking in such a way that they too become open to empirical challenge. Much of what we are inclined to treat as necessary assumptions are in fact only the petrified byproducts of earlier efforts at scientific inquiry, or the expressions of unjustified and unacknowledged philosophical prejudice. I have suggested reasons to reject the claim that the immutability of the laws of nature is an indispensable assumption of science. I now offer reasons to suppose, consistently with what we know of the workings of nature, as well as with the promising practice of scientific explanations, that the laws of nature may indeed change To say, however, that they may change is not to say that they do change. Whether they change, when they change, and how they change are all facts to discover in the course of the investigation of nature. Just gonna put me some more cha. Rooibos-te med vanillasmak. Rooibos tea I recommend. It's very tasty. The red bush from South Africa. There are three main reasons to think that the laws of nature may change. The first reason comes from the general view of the singular existence of the universe and of the inclusive reality of time that we defend and develop. It amounts to a philosophical conception, but only in the sense of a natural philosophy that seeks to work as the front line of natural science. One of the goals of natural philosophy is to rid science of the incubus of inherited metaphysical preconceptions inhibiting its advance. The second reason comes from the picture of the history of the universe that is in fact emerging in fragmentary and sometimes contradictory form from the discoveries of cosmologies. The striking disparities between what some established ideas predict to be true about the constitution of the universe and what we actually find should not discourage us. On the contrary, they should inspire us to formulate more clearly and boldly the most general meaning of the cosmological findings of the last several decades, in the hope that the formulation will help inform an agenda of research and theorizing that can overcome those disparities The third reason is the explanatory advantage of such an approach. The conjecture of the mutability of the laws of nature promises to expand the range of causal inquiry. It does so by suggesting that we might be able to explain historically why the laws are what they are, rather than consigning them to the factitious residue of the unexplainable. Moreover, it makes this suggestion without surrendering to the metaphysical rationalism of the principle of sufficient reason, or failing to recognize that science will never wholly explain why the world is what it is, rather than something else. The three reasons: the first from above, from an idea about the onlyness and the timeliness of this one real world. The second and third from below, from an account that refuses to sacrifice our strange and empirical discoveries on the altar of our conceptual biases converge. They converge toward a view in which the conjecture of the mutability of the laws of nature occupies a central place. This conjecture in turn suggests an enlargement of our vision of what scientific explanation can and should be like now. Non-emergent, global, irreversible, and continuous time admits of no exception to its rule. Nothing remains outside it. It is an irreducible feature of reality. That is a conception, a philosophical conception of what it would mean to take the idea of the reality to the limit. Affirming it without qualification. Such a view of the radical and inclusive reality of time seems to agree with our experience of the manifest world. It also gives the fullest, least restricted meaning to the idea that the universe has a history. The issue remains whether this conception of time is in fact realized in nature. A tenet of this book is that what science in general and cosmology in particular have already discovered gives us more reason to believe that this conception of time is realized in nature than to believe that it is not. The crux of the matter in the choice between these two views comes down to a contest between two ideas. The idea of a plurality of causally unconnected worlds and the idea of a succession of causally connected universes. That is to say, of universes connected across time by a causal succession that is stressed but never broken. The causal succession is stressed at moments of implosion and explosion, at which nature ceases to present a well-differentiated structure and the distinction between states of affairs and the laws governing them breaks down. This idea deepens the conception of a history of the universe, which is the greatest achievement of the cosmology of the last century. It prevents us from having to suppose, in contradiction to our observations and experiences, that time emerges and vanishes under certain conditions. It saves us from the need to temporize with a scholastic, fabrication of other universes with which, by definition, we can make no causal contact, of which consequently we can have no direct or indirect experience. It is in principle amenable to empirical inquiry. For previous universes or states of the universe must have left their mark on later universes or state. In parenthesis, this is of course history. And however, the idea of a succession of causally connected universes or of states of the universe exacts a price. The price is the rejection of a series of metaphysical glosses on the discoveries of science. Some of these slants are so deeply entrenched in our habits of mind that rather than being recognized for the juxtaposition of science and metaphysics that they are either accepted as facts of nature or embraced as requirements of reason. First among these prejudices is the idea of an unchanging framework of the laws of nature. When the physics of the 20th century undermine the idea of a space-time backdrop separate from the phenomena, it nevertheless reaffirmed the notion of an unchanging framework of natural laws. If everything changes sooner or later, so must the regularities of nature. Although some of them may change more slowly or more rarely than others. If everything changes sooner or later, so must the modes of change. Indeed, one way to define time is to say that it is the transformation of transformation. That the laws of nature may change is a direct implication of the reality of time. Such change may be discontinuous. This implication is feared and avoided. One can surmise, chiefly because of the threat that it is imagined to pose to the ambitions of science. However, it is not science that is threatened by the idea of the mutability of the laws of nature. It is a particular approach to science. This approach never overcame its ambivalence to recognition of the reality of time. It found reasons for this ambivalence in the use of the Newtonian paradigm, as well as in belief in a privileged relation of mathematics to nature. The ambivalence persisted in the physics of 20th century. It achieved one of its most stunning expressions in the effort under the aegis of the leading interpretations of general relativity to spatialize time, that is to say, to subject it to geometrical representation and analysis as part of a space-time manifold. That the laws of nature may change becomes less surprising and perplexing once we allow for the variable relation between the laws and the states of affairs that they govern. The universe is so constituted that it undergoes moments of radical reformation in which the distinction between the laws and the governed phenomena diminishes or even vanishes. Causal connections may even cease to exhibit the recurrent and general regularities and symmetries that are their hallmark in the cool-down universe. These are the same moments which changes more rapidly. The kinds of things that there are, as well as the ways in which they turn into other things. The phenomena may change more easily than the regularities. Laws, symmetries, and supposed constants. The regularities that appear to underwrite are causal explanations, but that are in fact only a codification of causal connections in their recurrent form, which we call laws of nature, change less readily and more rarely. The principles that these laws seem to obey, such as a conservation of energy, at least action, may change only at the limit of the most radical transformations in the history of the universe. What changes and how and when are not truths that can be inferred from the logic of scientific inquiry or from the extrapolation of our local experience of nature into universal and eternal attributes of nature. They are facts of the matter. They are not, however, simply facts about local pieces of nature. They are facts about the universe and its history, including the antecedents of this universe, in what may be a succession of universes or of states of the universe. The idea that the laws of nature may change is thus quite simply the notion that these laws, the laws invoked by our causal explanations, and even the basic and seemingly inviolate principles to which these laws conform, as well as the symmetries and supposed constants of nature, belong to the history of the universe. They are not outside that history and untouched by it. Consider how the idea that the laws of nature may change because they are inside time rather than outside it, relates to the intuitive core of what contemporary cosmology has to teach us. What it has to teach, that is to say, when considered without the blinkers of metaphysical assumptions hostile to acknowledgement of the inclusive reality of time. Any suggestion that the laws of nature may be mutable confronts the countervailing fact that they appear to have been stable from early in the history of the present universe. Departures from this stability, such as the suggested variations in the fine structure constant, are so uncommon and limited, as well as so disputed, that the possible exceptions seem only to confirm the permanence of the laws. However, this fact, if it is a fact, can be read in a way that shows why the mutability of the laws of nature may be not only compatible with the findings of contemporary cosmology, but also supported by them. In any argument about the mutability of the laws and other regularities of nature, the first objection to the claim of mutability is likely to be the observation of stability. Isn't that the thing hard to ignore? Although the stability of the regularities of nature is not strictly in contradiction with their mutability, it may be fairly held to support a presumption of their changelessness. There are two classes of arguments that can be made to reconcile the observed stability of the laws of nature with the conjecture of their mutability. The first class of arguments are rationalistic conclusions from some metaphysical principle about nature or about thought, such as the principle of sufficient reason, that we expect to hold independently of any observation or inference from observation of the workings of nature. In that sense, they can also be called a priori arguments. The second class are arguments that, although they may be speculative because they cannot be supported directly by observation or experiment, nevertheless result from and lead back to a view of the facts of the matter about our universe and its history. Such arguments form part of a view that must be susceptible to empirical test and challenge at the periphery of its implications, if not directly at the core of its most general ideas. The defense of the inclusive reality of time in chapter 4 is an example of such speculative but nevertheless empirical reasoning. To be faithful to the spirit and structure of these ideas, the argument for the reconciliation of stability with mutability must be of the second of these two orders of reasoning rather than of the first. It must not be tainted, so far as we can avoid it, by any metaphysical dogma upheld independently of our struggle in science to develop an understanding of how nature works. Considerations about the constraints on understanding and the requirements of scientific practice may be pertinent, however, they will be pertinent only as complements to a view that is, in a broad sense, empirical, not as substitutes for such a view. That the laws and other regularities of nature evolve makes them more susceptible to explanation than they would otherwise be. If we cannot explain them historically, we cannot explain them. That is to say, we can not explain why they are what they are, rather than something else. The only other option that we have is to explain them as expressions or impositions of our mathematical insight, taken as a revelation of the fundamental truths of nature, as mathematical oracles or prophecies. The laws and other regularities of nature might indeed be held to be timeless, as they generally have been held in the dominant tradition of physics, given the timelessness of the relations among mathematical propositions, that we cannot justifiably explain the laws of nature in this way, and on the basis infer their immutability from their stability, is a thesis to be further developed in chapter 6. In my argument here, we can best understand the stability of the laws and other regularities in nature in the context of our growing insight into the history of the universe. According to this proposal, the laws, symmetries, and constants are stable in the cool-down universe, which I described as the first or normal state of nature in my discussion on the second cosmological fallacy. The characteristics of nature in this state account for their stability. However, by the terms of that argument against the second cosmological fallacy, nature may also be and work in other forms, notably those that are associated with the fiery but nevertheless finite beginnings of the present universe, as well as with certain later situations in the course of the history of the universe that exhibit some of the features of those beginnings. These other forms of nature are far more hospitable to the rapid change of the kinds of things that there are, as well as the way in which they interact. Only the universal anachronism embodied in the second cosmological fallacy, the disposition to treat the workings of nature in the cool-down universe as its sole repertory of moods of change, would justify inferring the mutability of the laws of nature from their overall stability in the observed universe. To develop this idea, I now restate my earlier discussion of metamorphosis of nature during the history of the universe. And this is an excellent place to end this first part. And I feel definitely invigorated by what I realize. This is strength. This is the disappearance of abstract and theoretical thinking coming back with strength and no longer being that depressive, nonsensical, verbal garbage that we become accustomed to. No, these are fruitful openings to intellectuality, theorizing, but at the very same time, practicality, bodily movement, how we feel and how we stand. They most definitely go hand in hand, and they strengthen each other. It's a strong mind in a strong body, and vice versa. I think Unger points out infirmities in the present paradigm. They are infirmities rather than faults, and they can be helped and they can be healed. Knowledge can itself become whole and together again. I say thank you very much. It was a big pleasure. Have a very pleasant morning. Bye-bye for now. It's a bit windy today, I get the feeling. Look at that. All green. And that at the end of November. Must be the 23rd today.